so I'm going to try to soften a little bit, but I just want to ask this question. What do you do, or at least what are you supposed to do with your wants? And this is where I get into like, or what are you supposed to do with your desires? And again, I get it, like that's kind of a wacky question. For some of you, it feels like being asked, what are you feeling? Which is a really good question. But I was feeling a little liberated recently when I learned in some of the class I'm doing that there's now some research coming out that asking someone that question, certain Myers-Briggs types, it just shuts them down. Like feeling is just like, you just short circuit. Not that it's not a good thing to know, excuse me. But you just don't have words for it, which the substitute I'm learning is what's going on in your body. So what are you feeling? What's going on in your body? What are you supposed to do with your desires? I guess that's where I want to start this morning as we wrap up this conversation, why the pain? And maybe we could just get a little more specific. Like, and if you weren't uncomfortable before, wait for this. Like, what do you do with your sexual desires? Seriously, like whether you're a student, whether you're 13 years old, you're middle school student, a high school student, a college student, maybe you're a single person. Like, what do you do with your sexual desires? Maybe you're newly married and you're figuring out, like you thought that just kind of solved all of that energy and you're starting to figure out, like, no, there's still something to be managed there. Maybe you're newly divorced. I would imagine that brings a whole new set of questions that you haven't had for a while. Like, what are you supposed to do with your sexual desires? Maybe you have little kids at home and you don't understand how you have kids because you don't have time to even think about sex right now. Like, what do you do? Maybe you're someone who's in this new season of life and she works nights or he works nights or there's just things going on for you hormonally. What are we supposed to do with our sexual desires? And the reason I bring that one to the surface is because it seems to expose that do you have them isn't the right question. That suppressed desires don't disappear, like hidden desires, they don't go away, they just come out sideways. And there's all kinds of cultural things that happen when a person just suppresses the reality that they have sexual desires. In fact, many of us within the Christian tradition, we can see this long history of pain and shame that comes from a people created by God who created sexuality who didn't quite know what to do with those desires. The whole porn industry, it's predicated upon stuffed, suppressed, avoided sexual desires. I recently heard someone mention that STIs, like sexually transmitted illnesses, are way up in the state of Montana right now. And I have to think that complements some of the other research that I've heard, especially in that parenting research, is that more and more people, we're so connected to our phones and we're so inept at personal conversation that what's becoming more and more prevalent is alcohol-laden hookup culture. Because we don't actually know how to engage in relationship and start a dating relationship and move towards marriage. We just know how to get loaded and then we're free. What do you do with your sexual desires? And what if that illustrates for us that suppressed desire just gets all out of whack? Or what do you do with your desires for power? Now, we did a series a couple years ago where we explored this. Like, nobody walks into the office and says, just want to announce to everybody, I'm here for power. And yet the reality is that we're all after power. Social power, community power, the power that comes from being attractive, the power that comes from being proficient in your field, the power that comes from having a large community around you. What do you do with your desires for power? How do you process that? Or how about your desires for money? Again, it'd be really awkward to sit down across from somebody, grabbing a cup of coffee and go, I'm realizing I just desire more money. In our culture, that's not necessarily looked on very fondly, but I look back in my early 20s, and one of the most helpful things ever said to me was said to my friend Fred on this issue of money. He said, Adam, I must have been kind of doing the things that we do about money. And he said, Adam, here's what I think is a healthy stance. If you want more, go get it, because you can go make more money. And if you're happy with what you have, then keep your mouth shut. What do you do with your desires for money? Do you grovel? Do you compare? Do you judge? Do you steal? I mean, that issue just keeps coming up over and over. What happens when a person has been embezzling money for 10 years? Is it possible that's a desire for more money, which in and of itself is neutral, and yet it's been suppressed, it's been pushed down, and it comes out sideways? We're in this series called Why the Pain, and we started it by asking this question, and it was really this, of what if suffering, what if pain is in many senses a problem that we can't solve? That we are problem-solving machines. You may remember we had a whiteboard up here. We put math problems. We put all these things up here to try to illustrate, like, what if what it means to be human is to solve problems? And what if suffering it creates the experience that it does because we are humans and we love to solve problems. And when we bump into a problem that's not solvable or not easily solved, that creates pain. I was just talking to a friend in another part of the country this week who was very quickly sharing some deep parenting pain. And he got about halfway through and he stopped and he said, I don't even know why I'm saying this to you because everybody I ever talked to about my parenting problems, they just start giving me advice. And I can't tell you what he told the last person to give him advice was because there's words involved that wouldn't be appropriate from the stage. Why do we fail to listen to one another? Because we're human and we like to solve problems. Here's my point. What if another aspect of suffering and pain is we like to be in control of our joy? We like to be in control of our fulfillment. And suffering is joy removed. It's peace removed. And what if we can stuff desire and we can pretend they're not there and we can hide them behind our backs and we can let them come out sideways? But what if one of the things pain does is it brings quickly to the surface what our desires are, what they were? Maybe things we didn't even know we had, because when something's taken away, when a marriage is lost, when a job is lost, when we're grieving the loss of something or someone, suddenly desires that we may never even took the time to know were there, they come screaming to the surface. Sorry, I just spit all over the first row. Sorry about that, Brian. What if suffering exposes desire? And therefore, what if a strategy, because what we've been talking about is pain, for dealing with pain is to become people who are more comfortable and more healthy, noting and understanding and talking about what our desires are. Now, here's the good news. I'm not going to do that thing where I ask you to turn to your neighbor and tell them your 3 deepest desires, because that could get creepy fast, especially if you're married to the person next to you, because you might not be ready for that level of commitment to say those desires on that level. So we're not going to do that. Not yet. But what I do want to ask this morning is what are the people who have tried to follow God over the millennia, what are the people in the scriptures, what are guys like Paul and Jesus, what can they tell us about how they came to understand desire as it relates to God? Like, what do we do as people who are trying to attend to the holy? What do we do with our desires in that context? Some of you probably long ago gave up on prayer because the only understanding you had of prayer was it's how you get things. Others of you don't understand why to pray because what you understand is that prayer is all about surrendering things, and you feel like you have other practices to do that. What if neither of those captures entirely the way Paul, Jesus, and others in the text understood it? What are we supposed to do with our desires as it relates to God? You know, I was thinking this week, and frankly, the story I'm about to tell just illustrates the level of privilege that I've had in my life, but I was trying to think, like, what are the times in my life where desires have got me in trouble? What are the faith what are the crashes, the dark nights of the soul of faith that I've experienced? And one of them that I went back to, and some of you will remember this story, but goes all the way back to when the first few years when we lived here, when the city of Helena, through Amy Teagarden, got this grant through the Center for Disease Control. And so she invited me to be a part of that, us to be a part of that, and there were 7 or 8 of us that flew back to Baltimore for a week to be a part of this training. And as someone who struggles with anxiety, like traveling across the country by myself would be one of the things that triggers that for me. My friend Jim says, introverts like to be alone, but they don't like to be lonely, which is kind of my experience there. So going to Baltimore already kind of put me on edge, and it's not that I was alone, but I was staying in a room alone and all those different things. And then it was the first or second night there, I was actually talking to my wife on the phone. We were walking along the inner harbor of downtown Baltimore. I was with this group of 40-something women. We were walking down this harbor. It was dark outside, and we were coming up on this group, and it was one of these things that happened faster than I could process at the time. But someone from that group kind of peeled off, and they were coming right at us, and it was one of those weird things like, why is this person going to split our group of friends? It was like the Helena High hallways again, too, of this like game of show, like chicken that we're playing in the hall. But this one particular guy, he was a teenage African-American kid who was quite a bit taller than me. Before I didn't realize what was happening until it was all over. He came right at me, and then as he got up on me, he took a swing at me. I thought that's what he was doing. Other people who've lived on the East Coast have since explained, like, he probably wasn't trying to, like, punch you because he would have been successful if that's what he was really trying to do. He was probably trying to rip your phone out of your hand. But nonetheless, I did this duck thing, and I turned around, and he turned around, and luckily there were these 4 middle-aged women who got between he and I and protected me from him. So all was well. I'll never forget that scene. But that just put me on edge all the more for the rest of the week. And when Friday rolled around, I don't know about, we all have our own, you could do personality tests on airports, right? Like, when do you get there and what flight do you take and what time do you get there and all these things. One of the things I've learned is I hate taking flights in the middle of the afternoon. The day I'm flying out, I want to take the red-eye 6 a.m. flight, and I would prefer to be sitting at the gate at 3 a.m. Because my thinking is, if I miss the first flight, there's a second flight. And if I miss the first and the second flight, there's a third flight. But if I take the third flight, there may not be a fourth flight. So I like to get there early, but this conference is one of those that went halfway through it was Friday morning. And so that morning, I was worked up, and I had catastrophized like crazy, and there was a million different reasons why I was going to miss my plane and why I was going to have to move my entire existence to Baltimore because I would never get back to Helena again. And I was all kinds of worked up. I still remember getting on the train, going to the airport, where I was just freaking out. But part of what was going on for me in that season was I was really wrestling with something that's technically called open theism, which is this kind of nerdy theological thing, but I think it's an important thing, where open theism is asking some honest questions about just how much does providence control everything? I mean, we just even sang about providence. How far does God's control go? Does God control whether or not an airplane meets its schedule? Or is that one of those areas where God has backed away from control and we're in control? And I was all kinds of messed up inside of this, still kind of am in some ways. And so whereas for the last 10 years of following Jesus, within this season, I would have prayed God, help me get my flight. God, help me get my flight. God, help the plane not blow up so that there is a flight. All those different things. In this case, I felt this kind of enlightened spirituality because I wasn't praying at all for any of that. Because I was just convinced, I don't think God really wants to help me find a parking spot. And so I was just mute on all of that. I think that's probably why I was so worked up. And I remember I finally got to the airport, put my credit card in the kiosk thing, right, when you're checking in. And the first screen that came up was your flight has been overbooked. It's are you kidding? I've spent all week worrying about this. That's why I did this, to make sure this doesn't happen. And then it's always funny to me what they offer, it's and for a bag of peanuts, you could volunteer to stay behind and catch the next flight. And I'm start at $500,000 and let's work up from there. But no, I'm not interested in taking the next flight. It was only after that, and the years after that, and in some ways this series and the study that it provoked in me that I started to realize, wait a minute. I think part of what was going on there was this confusion about desire. This confusion about what am I supposed to do with desires as it relates to God? Because frankly, I don't necessarily believe that God controls every detail of everything. And therefore, I'm kind of confused. What am I supposed to do with all this as it relates to the holy? If you want to go find a spiritual practice, even a Christian spiritual practice that says the point of prayer is surrender, 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 you can find it. In fact, you could go back 4 or 5 years in our podcast stream and find me saying it. If you want to find other spiritual traditions that say the chief end of a person is to lose all want and desire, you can find it. It's prevalent. But it doesn't seem to be Jesus. I'm grateful for guys like Dallas Willard and N.T. Wright to push me out of my comfort zone and go, no, this Jesus that we claim to follow, he did practice prayer that was more than just surrender. I mean, just think for a second. I didn't put it on the screen, but just think even for a second of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. So our God who's right here, life's about you, not about me. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as is in heaven. Those are surrender statements. There's a few of them. But then consider the way the Lord's Prayer continues. Give us this day our daily bread. It's a desire, isn't it? And forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That's a desire for a certain kind of relationship, isn't it, with God, with others? And lead us not into temptation. It's a desire for God's weakness to cover our own because we're too weak, and it's an acknowledgement. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. It's an acknowledgement that left to ourselves, we're prone to self-destruction. It's a desire for God's help. So what are we supposed to do with this? And I think this is especially relevant in this conversation about suffering, because what's one of the things that happens when we suffer? It would seem like the simplest thing would be just shut off. Now, here's what I'm excited about this morning. We've been in this story, this 2,000-year-old story called the book of Philippians. Long before it was a book, in a book, it was a letter from a guy named Paul. Paul was this early follower of Jesus. I used to always say he wrote the majority of the New Testament, but I recently came to the realization he didn't write the majority of the New Testament. Luke wrote more words in the New Testament than Paul did. But nonetheless, he was this very influential Christ follower. He went to a place called Philippi, this Greek city, and he shared with these people this Jesus. And they rethought their plans for living and said, sign us up. We want to be a part of that kingdom. Years removed from that, Paul, who's done nothing but serve people in Jesus' name, is in jail. He's suffering. His circumstances have only grown worse since he started following Jesus. And he's writing a letter to some people in a place called Philippi who turned to follow him, and their lives have only become worse since starting to follow Jesus. And so what's going on, and you've had this person in your life, you've maybe even been this person in somebody else's life. What's going on, what's leading to the need for this letter is there's a third party in Philippi who is pointing out to the Philippians that if God was God, their circumstances wouldn't look like this. And if God was God, Paul's circumstances wouldn't look like this. And so more or less they're not even questioning the existence of God. They're questioning whether Paul's understanding of God and their belief in God is at all accurate. And Paul writes this letter to them because what they're putting out there is a very basic, now Western American formula: God plus your life equals success, wealth, and health. And Paul's letter, in many senses, is his going, there's another formula. Now, I don't have time to recount the whole series. If you're intrigued, you can go grab podcasts or jump on YouTube, thanks to Kate and Marla's work on the whole YouTube thing. But what's fascinating to me is that Paul ends his letter, having built all these different things into his perspective and the assistance he's trying to provide people as they make sense of God and suffering. He ends it by talking about desire. He ends it by bringing to the surface probably the most awkward thing to bring to the surface as we're dealing with somebody who's facing suffering. And that is this thing called wants and desires. In Philippians 4, towards the very end of this letter, listen to what Paul says. He says, do not be anxious about anything. Now, in Paul's day, one of the things Paul did often, and you can't always tell when he's doing it, but this seems like it's at least the possibility he's doing it here, is he would quote common things that you saw on a commercial while watching the NFL. Like he would quote these common cultural values and isms and teachings and beliefs, and then he would offer his counter to that. Do not be anxious about anything was a common Stoic statement in the Greek world. Stoicism was the dominant, I don't know if you'd call it religious, but philosophical worldview teaching of the day. And they talked a lot about anxiety and worry. And they said what Jesus said. They said it's a waste of energy. But guess what their answer? Like they said worrying is a complete waste of energy. Guess what they said you do instead? Guess what handle they said you push as an alternative to worry? Because you can't just tell somebody not to do something. You have to tell them what to do. Guess what their answer was? 2 words. Go ahead to that next slide. Accept fate. What the Stoics taught was this, again, this is an idea prevalent in our own day, that there's this mostly impersonal force who more or less is indifferent towards you, but mostly what it is, and to me what's ironic about this, and this is why I struggle sometimes with some of the open theism stuff, is in many ways it parallels the way we talk about providence or God's sovereignty, because mostly what they're saying is, the good news is the plan's already been laid out, so why are you worrying about it? Because it's all already been predetermined. That's the context. What they say is, don't worry, just if your flight's supposed to be canceled, it's going to be canceled. If it's not, it's not. So why waste your energy? Here's what Paul says as an alternative. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests, your desires, your wants to God. Notice Paul comes at this from a different perspective. His perspective is there's a benevolent God who hears cries, who pays attention, and who wants to hear from you. Now, this gets into our own kind of stuff about prayer, doesn't it? Why does he want to hear from us? What's the value of telling God your request? Listen to the way Paul continues in the next verse. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Here's some really good news. Paul doesn't say do that, because if you do it right or with the right formula or in the right posture, under the right denomination or in the right place or with the right attitude or with the right amount of faith, you'll get it. That's not Paul's argument. His argument is what? If you do this, there's this peace. There's this, and that's what we're after anyway, isn't it? Isn't that what we're after? Like the pursuit of sex, the pursuit of power, the pursuit of money. We're after something internal, aren't we? Paul is pointing out that that thing you desire starts, and this is part of why I'm growing in my respect for AAs, because this is their emphasis. It starts by getting right with God. And it's protected not by getting everything you want, but by talking to God about your wants. There's a difference there, isn't there? And to me, I mean, if you went up to someone who was going through a hard time and said this to them, they would be entitled to punch you in the nose. This is offensive stuff. To me, what gives weight to it is Paul's in jail. He's processed life. He's going through his own disappointment. We've talked in the past, he talks a lot about how he's praying that he would get out of jail, but what we know from history is he doesn't. He dies in the situation he's currently in. He's writing to people who know what it is to suffer. They've done the work. They've done the lament. And it seems like he's saying to them, listen. You got to get back to this place of desiring and talking to God about your desires. Now, this isn't day one. This isn't hour one. This probably isn't even week one. This is people who have been in the trenches of suffering for a while, and it's like he's wooing them out. Don't get stuck in that place where what you think is there's this impersonal, unkind being who controls everything. Return to the God of the cross. Get back there. Eugene Peterson, one of arguably the greatest pastor of our era, who recently just passed, the author of The Message, if you're familiar with that from your Bible app, read recently where he was asked, what's the purpose of prayer? Look at his own two-word response. Be disappointed, he said. He goes on to say, pray that heaven comes to earth, and lament that earth looks nothing like heaven. That we're engaged in this struggle, a struggle that looks just like the struggle God is in. A struggle where evil has shown up in his creation, and there's this acknowledgement of both sides. Now, here's what's fascinating all the more to me. Paul chases what we've read so far. Verse 8 is this: finally, brothers and sisters, whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Here's my question, and I'm not enough of a Bible scholar to answer my own question, and I'm not motivated enough to ask people who were, I guess. I am, but I just didn't. It sure feels to me like Philippians 4:6, do not be anxious about anything, but by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. It's like the flag on the top of the mountain. And on either sides of that pinnacle are these things that come with it, like in this case, a healthy mind. An ability to keep your thoughts from going toxic. I sat down with a friend this week who's embroiled in some of the local politics stuff that is going on around trails and stuff like that, and I was inspired when I walked away from the meeting as this man who's been more affected by it than probably anybody else. His commitment was unapologetically a desire to not get toxic, to not allow bitterness to take over his guts. And it sure seems like Paul says your capacity to have this kind of mind is tied directly to your ability to have this healthy thing going on between you and God. Here's the way I experience it, and I think what I've learned since that experience in Baltimore is as I'm walking to the office and I'm thinking about Christmas Eve gatherings and how we have this desire to give people a good experience and how I hope the staff has a good experience and how there's all these little details to the extent that like one little fuse going out could just sabotage the whole thing, and I get all kinds of worked up about all the things that could go wrong and might go wrong. What helps me in the midst of that is just telling God, God, I have this desire. And I'm not telling it because I necessarily think that therefore I get to just sit cross-legged on the sidewalk for the ensuing days and do nothing. And I'm not telling him that because I'm convinced that his creation is such that he has control over every little single detail in this moment. I'm just telling him as much because it just feels like I'm saying to someone with more power and more skill and more wisdom and more love than myself, here's my desires. And immediately I catch myself taking a deep breath. So what are your desires? Whether it deals with your power, your sex, your money, your health, your relationship world. What if part of what Paul is saying is it's not a tell God because he'll solve every problem because he'll just swoop in. It's like you have a life partner. And he's bigger and stronger and faster and more wise than you. And your system is designed to work in interdependence with him. In fact, on the front half of all this, and again, this is the part where I'm not much of a linguistic guy, and EJ last week was like, when are you going to take Greek? And my answer was, never. That's my answer to the question. I'm never taking Greek. Maybe someday, but I hope never. He teaches Greek, and I'm just... That's why God invented plagiarism, because then you learn from guys who invented that. Anyway, look at where this starts. Rejoice in the Lord always. These are the verses right before what we've been looking at. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Now, N.T. Wright points out that this word rejoice was a very public word. This is what they did when they celebrated Caesar. This is what they did when they went to local temple. This is ideally what you're doing on a Sunday morning here. It's this commitment to rejoicing in the empty tomb, irrespective of circumstances and current disposition and even intellectual assent. It's this public declaration of there's this God that I'm trying to know and follow. Verse 5, let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Notice, Paul's talking to these people who are going through hell. And one of his priorities for them is what? That they would continue to interact in the world, that they would somehow recover a way of interacting in the world that's full of kindness, not anger. You know that feeling when you go to your son or daughter's student-teacher conference and you sit across the table from someone who you think's probably been teaching for 20 years, and you just have this sense of like, whoa, she still likes kids. Or when you go to a place and you get a certain kind of service and you get the sense that this is a person who's done this, they've done loans, they've worked at the bank, they've sold real estate, they've taught kids, they've served coffee for a long, long time, and yet they're not crusty and they don't suck on lemons in the back room. They like people. They're still kind. You know that feeling? One of the things I'm just blown away by the Grand Street staff over and over and over again is, I mean, who spends more time with the public than Cal and Marianne and Dee and Jeff and Paige and Katie at the front desk? And yet if you ever interact with them, some of them who have been here for decades, there's a lightness and a kindness and a lack of cynicism and a like, yeah, use our stuff. And yeah, we're probably going to get hosed every once in a while. And yet here we are. I know I brag on the culture of the Blackfoot too much, but did you know that one of their policies is that their full-time staff, they work really hard to make sure their full-time staff doesn't work more than 4 days in a row? Because there's this fundamental belief from Brian, one of the founders, that it's really difficult to work with the public more than that many consecutive days and still like the public. And so it's a win-win. They want their employees to be healthy, and they want the experience people have to be healthy. It sure seems like what Paul is getting at here is as you're making sense of your pain, as you work through the suffering, as you've done the lamenting and the many things we've talked about thus far, which again, for some of us is years. This might be early in the process for you. Part of where he ends this thing, or rather the way he ends this thing, is this challenge to go, okay, but at the end of the day, you have a choice to make. Are you going to live from the perspective of grace and abundance and kindness and respect? Or are you going to allow the myriad ways that you've been hosed and taken advantage of and hurt and let down to cause you to be among the majority who leave this world cynical and bitter and angry and hurt and just shut down And at the core of all that, he seems to create this invitation, as though he's saying, I can't guarantee you that God will give you your every desire. What I can tell you is if you establish a healthy line of communication between God and yourself, many of those other goals become attainable. So let me ask you, what are your desires? What are your wants? What are the problems you've been trying to solve? And have you even started to tell God that you have that desire? What if he's there? What if he might not have the level of control that we all would like for him to have, but probably wouldn't if we actually knew the implications? But what if he's good and in control despite your pain? Let me pray. God, we get that you're probably more in charge than you are in control all the time, and so we just confess that to you. God, we also get that to be human is to desire, it's to want, and some of those are illegitimate and some of those are legitimate, and sometimes the best way to filter through all that is to not do it internally, but to externalize those desires to you. God, I pray for our homes and our relationships and our businesses and the way that we serve people in our jobs, the way we function as neighbors and community members and people who partake of restaurants and the post office and everything else, that you would make us the kinds of people who live with grace. Would you give us this skill of downloading our desires and wants on you and letting the conversation go from there? Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.